60 years. That's how long Edna Caldwell gave to one company. She started at 18, sewing hams on a factory floor. And by the time she was 77, her hands were so skilled they'd been insured like a concert pianist. She never married. She never traveled. She raised her dead sister's son on double shifts and devotion. And when the company was sold, they thanked her with a letter reducing her pension to $83 a month. 60 years of mastery, erased with one signature. When Edna turned to the only family she had left, the grandson she'd raised, the boy she'd fed and clothed and loved like her own, he sat at his kitchen table and let his wife do the talking. "We just don't have the space, Edna." At 78, with $41 in her purse and a plastic bag of clothes, Edna was put out on the street like something no longer worth keeping. But what nobody in that dying Pennsylvania mill town could have known, what the grandson who wouldn't meet her eyes, and the company that stole her pension, and the entire room of investors who laughed when she raised 3 crumpled dollar bills at a county auction could never have predicted, was that the condemned 6-story building they all called the death sentence was hiding something behind a sealed wall on its 5th floor. Something that hadn't been seen in over 50 years. Something that would rewrite an entire chapter of American history and prove that the hands they discarded were the only hands in the world capable of understanding what was inside. This is the story of a woman who was thrown away by everyone she ever served, and how a building everyone wanted demolished became the one thing no museum, no university, and no amount of money could replace. Don't leave yet. We're about to open a door some wanted to keep closed. Like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment wherever you're watching. Edna Caldwell was 78 years old and had exactly $41 in her purse on the morning the locks were changed. She stood on the sidewalk outside the one-bedroom apartment she'd rented for 11 years, holding a plastic bag of clothes and a sewing kit that weighed more than everything else she owned combined. The landlord's nephew, a thick-necked man in his 30s who couldn't meet her eyes, had taped an eviction notice to the door 3 weeks ago. She'd been behind 2 months. 2 months after 60 years of never missing a single payment on anything in her life. 60 years. That's how long Edna had worked at Hargrove & Sons Textile Company in Braddock, Pennsylvania. She started at 18, straight out of high school, hired as a floor girl hauling bolts of fabric. By 25, she was a seamstress. By 40, she was head seamstress, the one they called when a pattern didn't sit right, when a client needed something impossible, when a stitch had to be invisible and perfect and done by morning. She'd sewn wedding gowns for governors' daughters. She'd repaired tapestries that belonged in museums. Her hands had been considered so valuable that the company insured them separately, like a pianist's. She gave Hargrove & Sons everything. She never married. She never traveled. She never took a vacation longer than 4 days because there was always a deadline, always a client, always a project that only Edna could finish. When her sister died and left behind a 3-year-old boy named Marcus, Edna raised him alone, working double shifts to pay for his clothes, his school, his braces, his college applications. She loved that boy like her own blood. She would have walked through fire for him. And then Hargrove & Sons was sold. New ownership, a private equity firm from Philadelphia that had never touched a bolt of fabric in their lives. They gutted the pension fund within 6 months. 60 years of contributions, gone. They called it restructuring. They called it modernization. What it was theft, performed in a suit and tie, with a firm handshake and a lawyer's signature. Edna received a letter on her 77th birthday, informing her that her pension had been reduced to $83 a month. $83. For 60 years of her hands, her eyes, her back, her life. She'd gone to Marcus. Her grandson, now 34, married, living in a nice house 20 minutes away with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children. Edna had paid for that house's down payment. She'd never asked for it back. Marcus wouldn't look at her when she sat at his kitchen table and explained the situation. Jennifer did the talking. Jennifer always did the talking. "We just don't have the space, Edna. The kids need their rooms. Marcus works from home now. We converted the guest room into his office. You understand." Edna looked at Marcus. He stared at the table. "Maybe you could find a senior facility," Jennifer continued, her voice carrying that particular brightness people use when they've already decided and are just performing kindness. "There are programs, government assistance. You've worked your whole life. Surely there's something available." "Marcus," Edna said quietly. Just his name, nothing else. He finally looked up. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. She recognized that jaw. It was her sister's jaw. The jaw of someone who'd already surrendered but wanted to look like they were still fighting. "Jen's right, Mom." He'd called her Mom since he was 4. "We just can't right now. It's not forever, just until we figure things out." It was forever. Edna knew it the way old women know things, in the body, in the bones, in a place beneath language. She stood, kissed the top of his head the way she used to when he was small, and walked out. That had been 5 months ago. 5 months of stretching, $83 a month, and the remains of a tiny savings account that had been meant for her burial. 5 months of skipping meals, of sitting in the dark because electricity cost money, of washing her clothes in the bathroom sink. And now the apartment was gone too. Edna stood on that sidewalk in Braddock, Pennsylvania, on a cold Tuesday morning in October and took inventory of her life. A plastic bag, a sewing kit, $41, 78 years old. No home, no family willing to claim her. Hands that had created beauty for 6 decades now curled around the handles of a bag like a woman gripping the edge of a cliff. She walked. There was nothing else to do. She walked through Braddock's Main Street, past the boarded storefronts and the empty lots and the faded signs of businesses that had died when the mills closed. She walked past the old Hargrove building, now shuttered and dark, and felt nothing. She was past feeling anything about that place. At the corner of Elm and 4th, she stopped at a community bulletin board outside the post office. Among the flyers for lost dogs and lawn services and church suppers, one notice caught her eye. It was printed on yellow county paper, official and blunt. Allegheny County Tax Delinquent Property Auction. Today, 2 p.m., Municipal Building. All properties sold as is. Minimum bid, $1. Edna read it twice. Then she looked at the $41 in her purse. Then she looked at the sky, gray and heavy with coming rain, and made a decision that everyone who heard about it later would call insane. The municipal building's basement smelled like wet cardboard and burnt coffee. About 20 people sat in metal folding chairs, mostly men in work jackets, a few in suits, all of them flipping through printed property lists with the bored confidence of people who'd done this before. Edna took a seat in the back row. No one acknowledged her. The auctioneer was a county clerk named Phil, who clearly wanted to be somewhere else. He moved through properties quickly. A vacant lot went for $800. A fire-damaged duplex sold for $6,000. A commercial space with foundation problems brought $4,200. Edna watched the numbers climb past anything she could touch and felt the last scraps of her plan dissolving. Then Phil reached lot number 19 and sighed. "This one's a real piece of work, folks. Property at 211 River Street. Original Braddock River Mill, built 1898. 6-story brick industrial structure, approximately 42,000 square feet." He paused to let that sink in. "Abandoned since 1981. No utilities. Structural assessment rates it as severely compromised. Roof failure on upper floors. The county has recommended demolition 3 times. Asbestos likely present. No parking. No road access on the east side. And the property backs up to a floodplain." Someone in the front row laughed. "That's the one they call the skyscraper, right? Things been falling apart since I was a kid." Phil nodded. 6 stories. Tallest building in Braddock when it was built. Locals called it the skyscraper. Now it's the tallest liability in the county. Who wants to start at $1? Silence. Complete, total silence. 42,000 square feet of crumbling brick and broken promises. And not a single person in that room wanted any part of it. $3, Edna said. Every head turned. Phil squinted toward the back. "Ma'am, did you say $3? $3, Edna repeated. She was already standing, already holding the bills in her hand, already walking toward the front of the room, because she understood something none of these people did. She understood buildings that made beautiful things. She'd spent 60 years inside one. The laughter started before she reached the aisle. A woman her age buying a condemned 6-story mill with $3 bills. It was the funniest thing most of them had ever seen at a county auction. Phil looked at her with something caught between pity and genuine concern. "Ma'am, I'm legally required to inform you this building is condemned. It's not safe to enter, let alone inhabit. Are you sure about this?" Edna placed 3 worn dollar bills on the table. "I've never been more sure of anything." "Sold," Phil said quietly, shaking his head. "God help you." Edna took the deed, the survey map, and the rusted key that came in the envelope. She walked out of that basement with $38 left, a plastic bag of clothes, a sewing kit, and the deed to a building that everyone in Braddock called a death sentence waiting to happen. But for the first time in 5 months, Edna Caldwell owned something that no one could take from her. The building at 211 River Street looked worse in person than it had sounded in Phil's description. Edna stood across the street in the fading afternoon light and stared up at 6 stories of dark red brick, half the windows shattered, the rest so filthy they might as well have been. Iron fire escapes clung to the east wall like skeletal fingers. Pigeons moved in and out of the upper floors freely. The front entrance was a massive double door, industrial steel, dented and streaked with rust, but still hanging solid on its original hinges. The key didn't work. The lock had seized decades ago. But Edna found a side entrance on the alley, a smaller door with plywood nailed over it. The plywood was rotten. She pulled it away with her bare hands, splinters biting into her palms, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Mildew, oil, rust, pigeon waste, and beneath it all, the ghost of something else. Lanolin, machine grease, dye. The building still smelled like a textile mill, even after 40 years of silence. The ground floor was a vast open space, maybe 7,000 square feet, with thick timber columns rising to a ceiling 15 feet overhead. Industrial windows lined both long walls, most of them broken, letting in gray light and cold air. The concrete floor was cracked but solid. Old machinery bolts protruded from the ground where looms had once been anchored. Debris was everywhere. Broken glass, fallen plaster, pigeon nests, rusted metal, piles of wet newspaper turned into pulp. Against the far wall, a wide staircase with iron railings rose into darkness. Edna set her plastic bag and sewing kit on the floor. She was standing in the place where Braddock's textile industry had been born, where hundreds of people had worked, where fabric had been woven and cut and shipped across the country, where hands like hers had made things that mattered. She chose a corner near the staircase where 2 walls met, away from the broken windows and the worst of the draft. She swept the floor with a piece of cardboard, clearing glass and debris in a rough circle. She laid out her coat, sat on it, ate half a granola bar she'd been carrying in her purse for 2 days, and listened to the pigeons settling in the floors above. That first night, the cold came through the walls like something alive. October in western Pennsylvania does not forgive. Edna curled tight on the concrete, her thin sweater pulled over her knees, and shivered until her teeth hurt. Rats scratched somewhere in the dark. Wind moved through the broken windows with a low moan that filled the entire ground floor like an organ note. She did not sleep. She lay with her eyes open and her hands tucked against her body. The hands that had been insured, the hands that had made beautiful things, and she waited for morning. Dawn brought clarity and pain. Her back had locked up overnight. It took her 10 minutes to stand, her joints grinding, her muscles screaming from a night on cold concrete. But she stood. She stood because the alternative was lying down and waiting to die, and Edna Caldwell was not built for waiting. The first week was about not dying. She walked 3 miles to a Salvation Army and received a wool blanket, a thermos, and a bag of canned food. She had no can opener. She used a sharp rock and a piece of rebar from the mill floor, puncturing lids with bleeding fingers until the metal gave way. She ate cold beans standing at a broken window, watching the street below. Water came from a spigot behind a gas station 4 blocks away. The owner, a middle-aged man named Demetrius, saw her filling bottles one morning at 6 a.m. and came outside. "You the lady who bought the skyscraper?" Word traveled fast in Braddock. Edna nodded. Demetrius looked at her for a long time. Then he went inside and came back with a key. "Side doors always open till 10. Bathrooms in the back. Fill up whatever you need. And here." He handed her a heavy-duty flashlight and a pack of batteries. Building like that, you need light. Edna took the flashlight. She tried to thank him, but her voice cracked, so she just nodded again. Demetrius went back inside without making it awkward. That was a kindness she would never forget. She started cleaning the ground floor on day 3. No broom, so she used a flat board as a scraper, pushing debris toward the alley door in slow, aching passes. Every hour she rested. Every rest lasted longer than the one before. Her hands blistered, broke, bled, and hardened. Her back screamed through the first week, then settled into a dull roar, then slowly, gradually, stopped screaming at all. By the second week, she had cleared a section of ground floor roughly 30 feet square. The concrete beneath was in better shape than she'd expected. The timber columns in her section were solid, dense, old-growth oak that hadn't rotted because the ground floor stayed dry. She discovered that the massive industrial windows, though broken, sat in iron frames that were structurally sound. She stuffed the empty panes with plastic sheeting from a construction dumpster 3 blocks away, sealing out the worst of the wind. Carol Pulaski found Edna on day 12. Carol ran a Polish bakery on 3rd Street, and she'd heard about the old woman in the mill from Demetrius. She showed up at 7 in the morning with a bag of day-old bread, a thermos of hot coffee, and an expression that mixed horror with admiration. "You're actually living in here," Carol said, looking around at Edna's cleared corner, the blanket on the floor, the canned goods stacked neatly against the wall. "I'm actually living in here," Edna confirmed. Carol set the food down and put her hands on her hips. "Well, you need a broom, and a bucket, and probably a coat that doesn't have holes in it." She came back that afternoon with all 3, plus a camp stove and 2 propane canisters. And she came back the next day, and the day after. Within a week, Carol had appointed herself Edna's unofficial supply line, bringing food, tools, and cleaning products, always framing them as things she didn't need anymore, surplus from the bakery, extras from her garage. Edna paid her back the only way she could. She mended Carol's aprons. She repaired a tear in Carol's winter coat so perfectly that the fix was invisible. Carol held the coat up to the light and turned it 3 times, looking for the seam. "That's impossible," Carol said. "I can't even see where it was torn." 60 years of practice, Edna said. Carol stared at her. "You're not just some lady who sewed buttons. What exactly did you do?" "Everything," Edna said simply. A man named Roy Atkins became the second regular visitor. He was a retired building inspector, 70 years old, who'd actually inspected the mill back in 2004 when the county last considered demolishing it. He showed up because curiosity got the better of him. "I heard someone bought this place," he said, standing in the clear ground floor and looking up at the columns with professional eyes. "I had to see for myself." Roy walked the ground floor slowly, knocking on columns, testing the floor, examining the walls. Then he said something that changed everything. Ground floor and second floor are solid. Old-growth oak framing, brick-bearing walls 18 inches thick. They build these mills to hold 10-ton looms running at full vibration. The bones of this building are better than anything built in the last 50 years. Upper floors might be compromised, but down here, structurally, you're standing in a fortress. He started coming twice a week. He helped Edna seal the ground floor windows properly using salvage materials. He showed her how to check for structural weaknesses, how to test the floor before stepping on it, how to read the building's bones. And when Edna told him she wanted to get to the upper floors, Roy didn't tell her she was crazy. He told her to go slowly and test every step. It was on a cold morning in late November, 6 weeks after she'd moved in, that Edna climbed past the second floor for the first time. Roy had cleared the staircase up to 3, confirming it was sound. Edna went alone, carrying Demetrius's flashlight, moving carefully on steps that hadn't held weight in 4 decades. The third floor was open and empty, stripped bare, nothing but columns and windows and pigeon nests. The fourth floor was the same, but the fifth floor stopped her. A wall had been built across the staircase landing. Not an original wall, something added later, rough lumber nailed tight, blocking access completely. Someone had sealed off the 5th and 6th floors deliberately. Edna pressed her hand against the wood. It was dry, solid, not rotted. Whoever had built this wall had used good lumber and had wanted it to last. She went back downstairs and got Roy's crowbar. It took her 2 hours to pull the boards away, working carefully, stacking them on the landing. Behind the wall was a heavy door, industrial steel, like the ones on the ground floor. It was locked with a padlock so old the brass had turned green. Edna hit the padlock with the crowbar until it broke. She pushed the door open and stepped into the 5th floor of the Braddock River Mill, the floor that had been sealed for what looked like decades. And what she saw in the beam of her flashlight made her drop the crowbar. The entire floor was full. Not debris, not junk, not pigeon nests. Shelves. Wooden shelves running the length of the space in neat rows, and on those shelves, wrapped in cloth and tissue paper and carefully labeled with handwritten tags, were bolts of fabric. Hundreds of them. Behind the shelves, against the far wall, stood dress forms wearing garments. Coats, gowns, structured jackets, pieces that even from across the room Edna could tell were extraordinary. Glass cases held pattern books, sketch pads, tailor stools. A long work table sat in the center with a sewing machine still threaded, as if someone had stepped away for lunch and never come back. Edna moved through the space in a trance. She recognized the sewing machine. It was a Singer model 1591, a machine she'd trained on 60 years ago. She touched one of the garments on a dress form, a structured wool coat with hand-stitched lapels and a lining so precise it looked printed. The construction was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Every seam was finished by hand. Every dart was sculpted. The work was beyond expert. It was art. On the work table, beneath a sheet of protective muslin, lay a leather-bound sketchbook. Edna opened it carefully. The first page bore a name written in elegant, slanted script. Marguerite Aston. Personal Archive. Braddock River Mill. 1951 to 1967. Edna's hands began to shake. She knew that name. Every person who had ever worked in American textiles knew that name. Marguerite Aston had been the most brilliant textile designer of the mid-20th century, a black woman from Pittsburgh who had revolutionized pattern-making and structural garment design in an era that refused to credit her. She had worked anonymously, her designs attributed to white male designers, her innovations stolen and repackaged under other names. In 1967, she had vanished completely. No one knew where she'd gone or what had happened to her life's work. The fashion world assumed everything was lost. It wasn't lost. It was here. 5 floors up in a condemned mill that Edna Caldwell had bought for $3. Edna spent 3 days on the 5th floor before she told anyone. She moved through the archive slowly, reverently, the way you move through a cathedral. She counted 47 complete garments on dress forms. She counted over 300 bolts of original fabric, hand-dyed in colors that had somehow held their depth across decades in the dark. She found 11 sketchbooks filled with Marguerite Aston's drawings, hundreds of designs that the fashion world had never seen, structural innovations in draping and construction that were decades ahead of their time. Pattern books with notations in Aston's precise handwriting documented techniques that modern designers were only now beginning to attempt. On the 6th floor, sealed even tighter than the 5th, Edna found personal journals, photographs, and letters. Marguerite Aston had rented the top 2 floors of the Braddock River Mill in 1951 as a private studio, a place where she could work without surveillance, without theft, without white colleagues claiming credit for her genius. She had created her finest work here, in secret, building an archive she intended to reveal on her own terms. Her journals made clear that she knew the value of what she was making. One entry dated 1965 read simply, "They take everything I create in the open. What I make here, they will never touch. This belongs to the future." Edna told Roy first. He stood on the 5th floor, turning slowly, his mouth open, saying nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then he sat down on the worktable stool and rubbed his face with both hands. "Do you know what this is?" he said. Not a question. "I know exactly what this is," Edna replied. Carol was next. She cried. She walked between the dress forms, touching nothing, just looking, and cried without sound. Demetrius came, stood in the doorway, shook his head, and said, "Lady, you bought a museum for $3. Edna contacted the Carnegie Museum through Carol's nephew, who taught high school art history and nearly fainted when he saw the photographs. Within a week, Dr. Vanessa Okafor, the museum's head curator of American design, drove to Braddock. She was a tall woman in her 50s with careful hands and sharp eyes that went wide the moment she stepped onto the 5th floor. Dr. Okafor examined the garments, the sketchbooks, the pattern books, the journals. She worked in silence for 3 hours while Edna sat nearby and watched. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were red. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said slowly, "this is the most significant discovery in American fashion history in at least 50 years. Marguerite Aston is considered one of the most important designers of the 20th century, and everything she created privately, her real work, the work that was never stolen or attributed to someone else, has been right here. These garments alone would anchor an entire wing of any museum in the world. The sketchbooks rewrite the history of American pattern making. Some of these techniques weren't rediscovered until the 2000s. She did them in the 1950s. What happens now?" Edna asked. Dr. Okafor sat down across from her. "That depends on you. You own this building. You own everything inside it. Legally, this archive is yours. And its value, cultural, historical, financial, is extraordinary." The news broke 3 weeks later. A feature in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette picked up nationally. The Carnegie Museum announced a partnership with Edna to preserve, catalog, and eventually exhibit the Aston archive. Grant money arrived, enough to stabilize the building, restore the ground and second floors, install climate control for the archive on 5 and 6. The city of Braddock, which had tried to demolish the building 3 times, declared it a heritage landmark. Parsons School of Design sent researchers. The Smithsonian called. Edna's days transformed. She worked with Dr. Okafor's conservation team, and they quickly realized that Edna wasn't just the building's owner. She was the only person in the room who could fully understand Aston's construction techniques, because she'd been trained in the same tradition, on the same machines, in the same craft. She could look at a seam and explain what Aston had done and why. She could read the pattern notations that baffled the academics. 60 years of work that the world had dismissed as manual labor turned out to be exactly the expertise the archive required. The museum offered her a formal position, consulting curator, a title, a salary, and professional recognition for knowledge she'd carried in her hands her entire life. Marcus called in February. Edna was in the second-floor workspace that had been converted into her living quarters, warm and dry, with a proper bed and a kitchen, and windows that looked out over the river. She saw his name on the phone Carol had bought her and let it ring 4 times before answering. "Mom," his voice was tight, "I saw the news, about the building, about what you found." Edna said nothing. She waited. "Jennifer and I were talking. We feel terrible about how everything happened. We had no idea you were struggling that much. We want to make it right. There's plenty of room at the house now. The kids miss you." The kids had not called her once in 7 months. Neither had Marcus until the archive made national news. "Marcus," Edna said, "what exactly are you making right?" Silence on his end. "I stood in your kitchen and asked for help. You looked at the table. Jennifer told me to find a government program. You let me walk out your door with nowhere to go. You didn't call, you didn't check, you didn't wonder where your grandmother was sleeping or whether she was eating. For 7 months, I did not exist for you. That's not fair, Mom. We were dealing with a lot. I was sleeping on concrete, Marcus. I was eating cold beans with my fingers in a building that everyone in this town said would kill me. I was 78 years old and completely alone, and the boy I raised, the boy I gave everything to, couldn't find the room or the time or the courage to help me. And now that there are cameras and grants and museum people and my name in the newspaper, now you have room?" Marcus started to speak. Edna continued, her voice steady and quiet and absolutely immovable. "I love you. I will always love you. You are my sister's child, and I raised you, and that bond does not break. But I am not coming to your house. I am not giving you access to this archive or this building or anything connected to my name. This is mine. I earned it with these hands, the same hands that raised you, that worked 60 years, that bled on this floor to make it livable. I built this alone, with the help of strangers who became family, while my actual family decided I was too inconvenient to save." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler but no less final. "If you want a relationship with me, it starts with you sitting across from me and telling the truth about what happened and why. Not on the phone, not with Jennifer coaching you, just you and me, the way it used to be. But if you're calling because you think there's something here for you, there isn't. My will leaves this building and everything in it to the Carnegie Museum, with the condition that Margaret Aston's name stays on every piece forever. The people who helped me, Demetrius, Carol, Roy, they're taken care of. You'll get my sewing kit. That's the most valuable thing I own, and you won't understand why until you're much older." She hung up and sat for a long time in the quiet of her building. The building that everyone had laughed at. The building that was supposed to be her coffin and had become her cathedral instead. On a warm evening in early spring, Edna stood on the second-floor landing and looked down at the ground floor, now cleaned and restored, where Dr. Okafor's team was carefully preparing the first pieces of the Aston archive for public exhibition. Carol was downstairs arguing cheerfully with a museum technician about where to put the refreshments table for the opening reception. Roy was checking the staircase railing he'd repaired, testing it with his full weight, nodding with satisfaction. Demetrius had brought flowers from somewhere and was trying to find a vase. These people had carried her when her own blood would not. They had given without expectation, helped without obligation, and stayed without being asked. They were her family now, not by birth or law, but by the only thing that actually mattered, by choice. Edna looked at her hands. Scarred, callosed, rough-knuckled, the nails still stained from 60 years of dye and thread. Hands that the world had used and then discarded. Hands that had built everything twice. Once for people who never valued the work, and once for herself. She flexed her fingers slowly, feeling the familiar ache in every joint, and smiled. These hands still had plenty left to give. And now, finally, they would give on their own terms.